Hello and welcome to Army of Crime, your favorite movie slash comic book crossover podcast experience. My name is Matt, and I'm here with my co-host Dustin. Isn't that right?
What's up, everybody? Shout out.
And today we are taking a break from our comic book heavy season to talk about a film, a motion picture, if you will, of sorts, and its collected related works. And the reason that I thought we should do that is because we actually mentioned it last season. I don't know if you remember this.
I
Uh,
remember this.
you remember this. So I talked in our last season. We talked about. We mentioned what are we looking forward to that's going to come out in the like future, right? Like what's the thing that's going to come out um, in the foreseeable future or whatever. And I had said that one of those things was the new Dune movie, right? And then COVID happened and the release date got pushed back because I was gonna originally have like seen it by I think by the time the episode came out. And then of course I did not end up seeing it until we were like, fairly far into this season. It got pushed back a lot, but it did eventually come out. And I thought since I had talked about wanting to see it at the end of season one, we should probably squeeze it in to season two. And because I think it's an interesting topic. Dune, the movie, is a film directed by
He
oh,
is French Canadian. It is pronounced Denis Villeneuve.
who also directed like Blade Runner 2049 and like so he's not really he seems to do a lot of science fiction. They seem to keep backing the dump truck full of money up to his house to do science fiction.
Well, he started out as a making films in Canada, and he had become kind of a critical darling for several films. And he came to Hollywood, and Arrival was kind of like a big breakthrough critical and financial success for him. And then since then, he's now gotten on board several, or he then got hired to do another big budget science fiction movie, Blade Runner 2049. And then after that, he's now done Dune. So I think because of the success of Arrival, he's sort of become Hollywood's go-to, like thoughtful artist and science fiction blockbuster guy.
Yeah, it's an extremely specific niche for someone to occupy.
Well, he is apparently a huge fan of the book going back many years. So I think this was sort of a dream project for him.
Was it a dream project for the audience, Dustin?
Well, that's an interesting question because this is actually the third filmic adaptation of Frank Herbert's novel Dune. The book Dune, of course, is, I mean, it's hard to give like sort of a one sentence description of what Dune is about, but it's basically like a metaphor using science fiction for sort of like Western imperialism in the Middle East with these different great houses fighting over this desert planet that has a resource that powers global transportation, and basically control of this resource, which is spice in the world of Dune, is worth like a limitless amount of money.
Yeah,
And
and
so,
it's certainly written in 1965. You can see the traces of the kind of Cold War idea because you have like the Harkonnen, who
right.
their leader is named Vladimir.
Yeah, so you have the Harkonnens and the Atreides are sort of like the two Cold War superpowers battling over control of this desert and its like resources.
And then
But
it
then
kind
it,
of spins out into a lot of other
yeah,
things.
from there it goes
Certainly,
into all these other different philosophical and religious areas.
yeah. And it's interesting that I don't know if you know this. There's actually a school of thought of like national security, and like well placed like tech guys who study Dune for like lessons. This is like a real thing.
I did not know that. That is
Yeah.
really weird.
Yeah, I saw it pop up in the news. when they were talking about the, some people had a hard time as we sit here in the year of our Lord 2021, and who knows what year you're listening to this, on a radio, for entertainment while the cockroach people make you work in the diamond mines or whatever. But as we sit here in 2021, of course, the United States had to flee, defeated from Afghanistan after occupying the country for 20 years. And there was some degree of, well, we're the United States. Why are we losing a war against, Afghan militants? And it popped up in the news, and there was this, like, all like these national security kind of like wonks or like policy nerds, um, who read Dune or whatever, and they took like lessons from it or something, and were like, yes, it makes perfect sense. Because it's asymmetric warfare and yada yada. I don't remember all the ins and outs of it, but it's to say it has a large cultural footprint, just not in the way of, I think, like movies and action figures and toys so much, but it certainly left a stamp, on the culture and like science fiction as a genre.
I feel like to explain the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, you could have just looked at a history of American foreign policy over the last 100 years.
Sure. I
I'm
mean, I'm
not.
not saying that that's an analysis that we should all take up. It is a thing that people were scratching their heads about.
So, yeah. So Dune, as you mentioned, was adapted into a film in the 1980s, in the mid 80s, directed by David Lynch, and at that time was sort of meant to cash in on the post Star Wars wave of science fiction epics, and it was a sort of a infamous like box office and critical boondoggle. And then in the early 2000s, there was a television miniseries made for the Sci Fi Channel, which labeled itself Frank Herbert's Dune, as, I suppose, a nod to the fact that they were aiming for a more literal adaptation because David Lynch's version was very liberal with the source material. And then now we have the third adaptation, which is sort of attempting to bridge the gap between those two kind of takes. And
And
we
I
have
think
both.
benefits tremendously from the fact that the studios are happy to splice movies into like multiple chunks. So you can just make like part one of a book.
Yeah, because David Lynch's version really suffered from the fact that they were forced to condense a very dense novel down into a 2 hour film.
Right, 400 pages novel down into 2 hours. Uh, I mean, is that even possible? Who knows? It was sort of considered an unfilmable book, and I remember there was this people, kind of nerds on the internet would chatter that it should really be like a HBO series or something and not a movie because there's too much of it. But, in the wake of, they let The Hobbit be 3 movies. So yeah, sure, why not? Dune could be 2 movies. You can break things apart now and not you don't have to have an ending to the first part or like a definitive ending. And I think it,
Yes.
it benefits from that tremendously.
Yeah, so the new Dune movie is in fact an adaptation of the first half of the novel Dune. And as I recall, we're both fans of the new Dune film. Is that correct?
Yes,
And you
absolutely.
are a fan of the science fiction, the Sci-Fi Channel version,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
I
within
am
its
a
limitations.
fan of the David Lynch version. As I recall, you are not a fan of the David
I
Lynch
mean, I
version.
remember it being, sort of interesting. Like the art style was probably the thing that stuck with me the most. A lot of choices were made, and it was a difficult. Could anyone have done better? I don't know.
So before we get into all of that, I would just be curious to hear your thoughts because I know you are a big Dune fan and have read all of the novels. So I would be curious, was your take on the new Dune film?
Well, I mean, I thought it was great. I think it's a tremendous adaptation. Just as like an adaptation, yeah, I think they managed to really capture a lot of what makes the book interesting. I remember seeing some of the early images and being a little concerned that it looked sort of generic, right? There's a lot of like gray and black, and it seemed like they were trying to make it, uh, as colorless as possible to maybe separate it. I don't know. I'm not sure. It seems like that's kind of the style now, right? When you adapt like a superhero, for example, you take away the color. It's like a thing they do now. Middle movies that take place in the Middle Ages, everyone's always running around in black, even though they used to wear bright colors all the time. And I was a little concerned that it might end up being generic, but I think the visual style of it actually captures some of the weirdness of Dune because it's like feudalism in space, and that is sort of odd. And I think they kind of capture that. I liked, there's a lot of things I liked about it. I thought that like sound design was great, like the sound and the music. There's a lot of very well done sequences. I mean, the actors are all good. There's a lot to like about it. I appreciated. There's a lot of small things I appreciated, like the fact that their spaceships all look like weird, like tubes that zip around, which is kind of separates it out from like Star Wars or something. And Dune is meant to be kind of weird, so I think that is a good choice. I thought they did a good job with a lot of it, like the Benny Gesserit. I was a little annoyed, that they kept like the little nose plugs thing from David Lynch, but the Fremen do wear like full masks and stuff as they should running around in the desert. So I thought it was good. I really don't have a lot of complaints about the movie. I think it's about as good as anyone could do adapting something like Dune into a movie. If you've never read the book, there are long sequences of like people thinking, and then they're like thinking at each other, and like someone will be thinking about trying to figure out what someone else is thinking about. So a literal adaptation is not really possible. So I think this is pretty good. This is about as good as somebody could do. I'm not sure what you could do to like lift it up a lot. I mean, there's a couple ideas I could, if you held a gun to my head, I could think of some stuff from the book that it maybe would have been neat to see. But
Yeah, I liked the Dune movie a lot as well, and I think that you said that it's about as good as Hollywood could probably do for an adaptation of the book Dune, which is probably true. And I think I feel like they found maybe the perfect director for a project like this because Denis Villeneuve is sort of an odd duck, or maybe even a throwback in the current Hollywood system because he's kind of like an old-fashioned Hollywood auteur, of which there used to be a lot of, which were people working inside the studio system who have their own like distinct style. And in particular, I think he, I find his work, his films kind of fascinating with his very like deliberate like sense of pace and his deliberate like focus on visuals of like light and texture and his interest in like these like larger thoughtful questions of humanity. So I think if you look at there are a lot of like Hollywood directors when you look at like big budget science fiction films. I mean like a J.J. Abrams or people like that who are not like terrible in any sense really. Or maybe you would say they're terrible. I don't know. I don't have strong feelings one way or the other. But they don't really, there's no like poetry there. There's no, like soulfulness, or at least a discernible point of view, if nothing else. So not to like say that Denis Villeneuve is like, the greatest filmmaker in the world or anything like that, because I wouldn't go that far. But I think his particular sensibility was a great fit for the material, and it's kind of a shame, because Hollywood used to have a lot of guys like that who had their own kind of distinctive style, and now they really don't have that many. But I think he was a great fit for the film, and I think he did a fantastic job. And you mentioned the actors. This film has a pretty like standout cast, like even all these like small parts in the film that are only in like one or two scenes will have like really like fantastic like actors in it, which is pretty fun to see. Like you've got Duke Leto Atreides is played by Oscar Isaac. The one
who I
person
learned recently is going to be Moon Knight.
yes, he and Ethan Hawke, I believe, are starring in a Moon Knight television show, which is are having LeBron James be on like a middle school basketball team.
But sure,
But
why not? If you've got infinite supply of money or
yeah,
whatever.
he's got like boat payments to make, perhaps. But and then Timothy Chalamet is Paul Atreides, and Rebecca Ferguson is Jessica, and let's see, Stilgar is Javier Bardem, Channy is Zendaya. Jason Momoa is Duncan Idaho, which so you have like all these really good actors who are on screen, and many of them for just like a couple scenes.
Yeah,
And I thought that all there's no, I don't think that there is really like a wrong note in any of the cast. Stellan Skarsgård plays the Baron Harkonnen, and he's not as overtly revolting as the version as like David Lynch's version, which is probably David Lynch's version is actually probably closer to the book, which is
yeah.
a weird thing that David Lynch's was more accurate than this version, but
Right. The Harkonnen are even in the novel just like cartoonishly evil, just cartoonishly evil space Nazis with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And they actually toned it down a little bit, which watching the movie you would never guess that was the slightly toned down version. They dialed it back a few notches.
yeah. And you mentioned the sound design, which I also think is great, which is another I think Denis Villeneuve thing is that he's got a great ear for like an all enveloping, sound design. Like
Yeah.
very deliberate choices in like what you are hearing at all times, whether it be the score or just like the effects from various, like ships and weapons and such.
The weird tubes zipping around.
Yeah, like I think that he made some pretty great choices in that regard.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think one thing the movie does really excellent at is capturing a sense of scale,
yeah,
because you really get a sense of like these tiny people dehumanized by this gigantic world, like this gigantic world with these little itty bitty people in it. And I think it's a very intentional choice to show like, how insignificant a single human is against like the wheels of civilization or whatever. Like you have these giant systems, giant planets, giant everything, right? And then like the little people running around inevitably getting crushed.
yeah, I agree. That's it works really well. It makes me think of like, I mean, he had a similar great sense of scale, like in the movie Arrival, when you first see the alien ships, and like when you see the Atreides first arrive on Dune, like it really emphasizes the sort of alienness of how out of place they are on this like desert planet, if you will.
Yeah, do you want to know one thing I actually liked better in the Sci-Fi Channel series?
What's that?
I kind of have a soft spot for the Baron in the Sci-Fi Channel series. I'm gonna be honest. Probably, I don't know if anyone else can take that journey with me.
Why is that?
I just feel like the Baron in the Sci-Fi Channel series is almost like a sort of self-aware, like genre savvy. Like he's just this like clever little person, who's just sort of like cackling to himself. And he is not. He's like a normal sized person. Like in here, they have uh um Skarsgård is wearing like a fat suit, so he can be enormously obese. I mean, there are real. I suppose you could find a real human that's that large, but like very large, like to the point where he is not able to move on his own. Right, he has to use the suspensors. And then like you mentioned, the David Lynch version is like over the top gross. You have like the Baron has like all these pustules all over him for whatever reason. You would think being super rich he could afford better skincare. I don't know. I kind of like the Sci-Fi Channel Baron. I felt he had like a fun little quality, as sort of like this self-aware, clever little person, like mucking about with people, like a little puppet master character, which I don't think you got as much in this movie. In this, the kind of vibe I got from the Baron in this movie is like a kind of like a mafia boss or something.
Yeah, and you don't, because this is the first half of the book, the characters like the Baron, I don't think are on screen as much as you might expect. Yeah, the Sci Fi Channel version is, and we can talk about this, but it's kind of the thing that if you is most known for now is that it was done on like a shoestring budget. So when you compare it to like the Hollywood blockbuster version in this that you see in the newest version, it's like pretty, it looks like a community theater version of Dune. I mean, it's not like probably fair to hold against it to some degree, but it's I think it
It
and it's
ultimately, I think, does suffer from the limitations of the production
Yeah, and I
in a
don't
way
wonder
that
if
either the Lynch or the new version does not.
yeah, I mean like in the Lynch version, I think he's able to paper over some of the abridgment issues and practical issues with the creativity on display, whereas the Sci-Fi Channel version feels kind of like cheap and uninspired, just in the sense that like they set out to make an extremely faithful adaptation, and because of that, there's no like bizarre, flights of fancy like in the David Lynch version when you have like the space guild navigators being pushed inside like a giant tank with like a weird goth attendant speaking through a giant microphone thingy, which has no analog in the book, but it actually does kind of work in the universe of Dune, and it looks really cool and is extremely memorable.
Yeah, and he decided that all the Bene Gesserit should be bald.
Yeah,
But like, why not? Why not?
sure, it works.
Yeah. Some of
I
the designs, I think there are a lot of good designs in the new movie, though less out there as than the Lynch version, but like the Stardew car make a good impression, for
yeah,
example.
it's funny because in all the versions they abandoned the idea of the Sardu car wearing Harkonnen uniforms, which is kind of like a big plot point in the book because they're attempting to be sneaky about it, but instead they all wear these like distinctive like spacesuits kind of.
Yeah, with the
Which I don't.
Mongolian throat singing at like
Yeah,
their induction ceremony.
I do like the Lynch's Sardu car as well, where they also have like spacesuits, but they have like they're like glowing green kind of like. I don't know if the idea is that they're on Salusa Secundus, where they're from, if they're used to such like a harsh environment, they have to like be protected from the air of other planets or something like that. But it makes them
Yeah,
look very intimidating.
makes them look like they're radioactive,
It kind of does, yeah.
like they were all exposed to radiation or something. You know why I think and why I wanted to see this new Dune and why I thought it was neat that they were making a movie because they're kind of making a movie out of everything now. So that in and of itself is not, if you really have a hope for eventually there'll be like a movie about Man Wolf or something. I mean, it's all going to be everything's going to be a movie now. I think that's where we're trending. But the reason I think Dune is sort of uh particular or I mean, at least in my humble opinion, is thematically, I think Dune is a little more interesting, and I think the kind of message of Dune is something that everyone could use to have planted in their brain to think about. Especially compared to other like big blockbuster movies. What
And
do you
what
say to that, Dune? To that,
well,
Dustin?
what is in that then? What is the message of doing that you're saying needs that you know is worth
So
getting out there?
yeah, and they kind of touch on this a little in the movie, but the Frank Herbert had this big thing, and if you've never read the book, I mean, you should certainly read the book. It's almost 60 years old now. So I mean, if you haven't read it yet, that's a conscious decision to do. So I'm not going to like go over all the stuff that happens, but certainly in the book, Frank Herbert had this big idea that heroes and like hero characters were troublesome, and that we should not trust people who are like leading us to victory and that like institutions in and of themselves are the problem. Like failed institutions will produce more failed outcomes. It doesn't matter what sort of leaders you swap in and out. And it's sort of the opposite of something like Star Wars or Marvel or whatever. Like the idea that there's like a hero person who we can all look up to and say like, yeah, they did a good job. In Dune, the idea is that like that's bad. Like we should not trust any one individual to solve our problems.
Yeah, Dune sort of very intentionally subverts the idea of the traditional hero, and you don't actually get as much of that in just adapting the first half of the book into a film. But that I think is the overall arc of at least the story of Paul is the idea of him being the chosen one hero type who's going to save the world, and how that's in fact not is actually way more complicated than that. and how
Right,
that we should be leery of people who are the chosen one heroes who are going to save the world.
right. Because that's not how it works in real life, certainly. Supposedly, Frank Herbert was thinking of JFK at the time. I guess Paul is sort of JFK. The idea like this really charismatic president, which I don't know if that analogy pans out any further, but it's applicable to. I mean, it's applicable to just like society at large, to history, really. If you find historical examples of like charismatic leaders who take power, I mean, that almost never ends well. The idea of going to war against, going to war against your enemies, uh, like I think Dune would lead us to the conclusion that all wars are in fact bad, even justified wars. All empires are bad. It's not just a matter of like smashing up the bad guys. And supposedly they want to adapt Dune Messiah into a book, which would actually, or into a movie, which would actually really help land the plane because that's really some of the stuff he goes into in Messiah and would really make it the ultimate like feel bad blockbuster like bummer trilogy of Hollywood.
Yeah, which is something that the other, like in the David Lynch version, it's been condensed to the degree where Paul actually is like some kind of messiah because he famously like makes it rain on Dune at the end, which in terms of the book and even of that film itself doesn't make any sense, but it sort of like demonstrates him as being like an actual messiah. He's like the hero, chosen one who saves the day, and then the end. So, and I don't know if that's just because that was not, that kind of critique was just not something that David Lynch was interested in, or if that was, just through the process of abridging the book into a script that stuff kind of got left out. I mean, David Lynch's interest in Dune, I think, was much more with the religious angle, which is certainly not discarded in this adaptation either.
Right. And they specifically, in Dune, the book and this new movie adaptation, there was discussion of like religious traditions being created to help like shepherd people along or to help like control societies,
Yeah,
which is a thing that has perhaps happened also in real life. One assumes, I don't know, right? I think that's a good, I think it's a relevant message. And again, if we're comparing it to other blockbusters, I think there's a lot more to think about. Not to slam blockbusters in general, but it's an interesting mixture because you do get the epic battle scenes and the laser beams. There are literal giant laser beams, and like floating like space samurai dueling each other. But there is something going on under the hood that I think makes an interesting contrast to other similar types of epics,
sure.
like big
Yeah.
movies that are coming out.
It's kind of like Lawrence of Arabia in space.
It is kind of like Lawrence of Arabia in Space, which I assume is almost it must be an intentional analogy because it does fit so well in some ways, but also you have to it fits even better than like because if you track the whole like historical arc, we
Right.
see that Lawrence, even as a well-intentioned person, like where are the Arabs now? Where's the British Empire now? Like the arc of history has a way of like mutating that into something else over time.
I know there is some continuing controversy about Dune and the way it appropriates like Arab culture, and they pointedly do not use the word jihad in this movie, which is frequently used in the novel. And their solution to that seems to be to sort of use the or cast the Fremen as sort of like a multi-ethnic group of people, which is the end result being that I don't think there are any like Arab actors cast in this movie, which
Yeah, I
they
mean, it
seem
would
like
certainly make sense to
rep.
cast Arab or North African people as the Fremen. I
Kind of makes you wonder if they were nervous about being that explicit with like the parallels, the cultural parallels. So instead they tried to just like sidestep it entirely, which I don't know if that's the right solution or not. But
yeah, it's a difficult, it's a Gordian knot of the adaptation. I don't think, as far as I'm aware, Frank Herbert in the book does not explicitly try and just like ascribe, um, like what we would recognize as like racial categories to any of the people, really. Um, I mean, one of them is named Vladimir. I mean, you can kind of guess based on their names, but it's supposed to be 20,000 years in the future where all those sorts of categories have been like scrambled to some degree. Um, like the Fremen are, I believe, descended from the Zensuni wanderers who travel to Dune after like migrating, and they practice like some form of Islam, but it's never like abundantly clear if they're meant to be. Certainly there are non-Arab Muslims or whatever, and it's not abundantly clear if they're all meant to be Arab. But of course, if you're adapting into a movie, you do have to make choices regarding like actually existing actors to be standing there. And yeah, they sort of split the difference, I think, because they did they scrubbed some of that language, as you mentioned, from the movie. I suppose just to make it a little more generic, because it is a on some level a story about colonialism and empires that sort of writ large can apply to a lot of historical situations. Obviously, there's like a resource war in the desert, which is pretty specific, but similar conflicts can be found throughout history. I don't know what the right choice would be in that regard.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there is like a perfect way, to thread that. And it's tricky too because this, on the surface, it appears to be sort of like a white savior narrative. But as with Lawrence of Arabia, the full scope of the story kind of like undercuts that idea. But I think it's harder to get that across when you're only adapting what's I think ideally they talked about doing the second half of the book as part two and then Dune Messiah as part three. So if that ends up being true, we're seeing like basically the first act of the story.
Right. And yeah,
So
based solely on looking at this, if you didn't know anything about it, you might assume that it was like a white savior narrative.
like it was literally the thing that it was, and that it is in fact critiquing once the full scope of the story is, you
Yeah.
know,
And I think
will
there's still a criticism there. Certainly, almost makes me think of like Sam Peckinpah would make movies about how like awful war and violence are and how much of it's like a thing that like plagues human society, but it also had lots of war and violence in them. So it's kind of like having your cake and eating it too. And you could I suppose make that argument about Dune that in some way he is intentionally sort of having fun with this convention before blowing it up later, and he does blow it up pretty thoroughly. But on a basic level, yes, the first stretch of Dune is about a an outsider coming to an alien culture and like learning their ways and then teaching them things and then becoming their leader and leading them against enemies, which is like the plot of all kinds of like movies made about like white people taking up
right.
some other culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's doing it to blow it up later. But I think you could make a fair critique that the better answer would be to stage it from some entirely other perspective. But it
Right.
is what it is. He does follow through all the way through, I think, on that.
Here's a question. What things from the other Dune adaptations did you like as well, in addition to, this movie? But were there other things from the other adaptations that were better, or do you think those other versions of Dune are worth watching, or is this like they got it right now, so one does not need to bother with like the Sci-Fi Channel version?
It's an interesting question. I do like some of the visual designs from the Lynch movie. I think that like you mentioned the Guild Navigators. I think the Guild Navigators are cool. I'm not sure why they're bald, but like bald Benny Gesserit have kind of a charm to them.
Also, it's worth
And
noting that the coward Denis Villeneuve does not actually show the bending of space by the Guild Navigators, unlike David Lynch, who
yeah,
shows the Guild Navigator like floating through some kind of like sparkly lightning area and then like vomiting out something or another that and then like warping. Like he actually shows the entirety of like the bizarre creatures like warping time. Anyway.
yeah. Although I would point out, Dustin, that it is not the navigators that warp time, but the engines of their ship. The navigators are able to successfully travel through space. without the use of navigation computers. But sure.
Right. I mean, I don't know that that nuance is technically found in the way that David Lynch presents it. But
Yeah.
yes, you are correct. The navigators are able to see the future and thus navigate a faster than light ship through the stars. Is
I
in
also
fact,
I always have a soft spot. Again, I have no idea why they look the way they look, but like the Mentats in the David Lynch version.
yes, they have the red lip stain, which is from the books.
Yeah.
But he also gives them all of these distinctive giant eyebrows, which are kind of fun.
Yeah. I like the idea that the Mentats stand out as like these oddities
Right.
that you can like pick them out at a distance. Because the Mentat are of course trained in Dune, they have no computers or thinking computers. And so the Mentats are like human computers, people who've trained their minds to do calculations. So if you're like an important or wealthy person, you would keep a Mentat around to like keep track of all your, instead of having Excel spreadsheets or whatever, you have a Mentat. So they are sort of like human appliances or something. So I think it makes sense to have them kind of stand out visually. I didn't mind the Mentats in the new movie. I know some of the nerds were upset that word Mentat is never said, nor are they explained, but I feel like you kind of get the idea. I feel like the idea comes across.
Yeah, because you see uh, Thufir Howard doing like a calculation kind of, where like his eyes roll back into his head and he's like doing the human computer thing.
Yeah. I liked the Stardew car are good. I like the Stardew car in both versions. One thing I was disappointed is we did not get Gurney playing a song. I guess if I had to come up with some quibbles of stuff that the other adaptations,
Yeah. Apparently, they did record Gurney playing a song and it was cut.
yeah, I would like to see that. I'd be curious to see that Gurney playing a song. Uh,
Apparently, they also filmed the dinner banquet scene from the beginning of the book, but it was got cut as well.
yeah, is that confirmed or is that a hot rumor?
I believe that's for reals. That
Yeah.
one of the I think that somebody said that one of the
Yeah, I mean
actors.
that's it's a fan favorite scene, but of course, as a lot much of Dune does, it takes place largely with people saying things and then thinking about them, and then like looking around and thinking at what everyone else might be thinking. So perhaps tricky to adapt, I suppose.
I mean,
Uh,
maybe they'll do the extended mega cut at some point. Who knows?
he claims he doesn't want to do one, but the studio could always just come up with one if they wanted to.
That's what they did to David Lynch,
Yeah,
and then he
if
had
if
to
if if
had to
the if
take
they
his
thought
name
somebody
off it.
would pay cash out dollars for it. I guess my only other quibble would maybe be it would Dr. Yui. I could have there's apparently footage that was cut of Dr. Yui talking to Paul. Um like a little more of Dr. Yui might have been interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know that in this film they actually do a great job establishing why he betrays them as much. It kind of seems to come out of nowhere.
It does, and it's a hard thing to set up at the beginning of a story because he is ultimately sort of a minor character.
Yeah. And as soon as you mention that, I mean, the book gives you the knowledge that Dr. Yui is a traitor before anything happens. Whereas the movie, they want to serve, they save it to be like an actual twist. But as soon as you give the backstory of that his wife was kidnapped by the Harkonnens who are torturing her, it kind of like makes it obvious in that he's going to betray them. But then to like go against that, you'd have to explain what the imperial conditioning is, which is like another setup that you would have to do, which they. So I think a lot of that just seems to have been sliced out, which is not horrendous. I mean, it still works, but it is one of those things where if you haven't read the book, you might be a little like, wait, what?
Right, like in Dune, there's these great schools of conditioning, like the Imperial Doctor conditioning, the Suk Doctors, the Swordsman. So like Duncan, Idaho is literally I think they're called the Swordsmen of Ganaz, and they're like specially trained super space warriors or whatever. I mean, he is that comes across in the movie, but we don't know that he went to some special like academy that the House gets to send certain numbers of their guys to, and then the Bene Gesserit and the Mentats are all in there. I mean, I think that all comes across without having to be laid out. One of the things that I appreciated that the movie does well, since we're talking about those little quibbles, is they really did not load it down with exposition. And I think when you have a movie like a sci-fi fantasy, whatever, there's this danger of trying to like explain a bunch of stuff. I would shudder to think of like, they do this thing in and there are Marvel movies that I like, but I always think of like Marvel movies, or even like I think of in like Rogue One where they spend like the first 20 minutes doing like a backstory of somebody, and then being
Yeah,
like 10 years later, now the real movie starts, like that kind of thing. And they don't attempt to do any of that, and that's very much appreciated from me.
yeah. I think Denis Villeneuve is I committed as like a visual storyteller to some degree, because if you look in like Arrival and Blade Runner 2049, which are his previous films, but also compared in terms of genre and budget, he uses visuals to sort of advance the mood and advance the story, and seems to be less enamored with page after page of exposition. Because both of those films, I mean, even like Blade Runner intentionally sidesteps like solving the most overwhelming mystery that people had from the original film, which is
Having
about.
read, oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Having read, you've not read all of them. What extremely wacky thing from the rest of the series are you looking forward to them making the actors do, assuming
Well,
that it actually happens?
I recently did read the book God Emperor of Dune, which is the fourth Dune novel, and is set, I think, 5,000 years or 3,000 years after the events of Dune. And the main character is Paul's son, who has transformed into a sandworm with a human face. And as I was reading it, I was wondering, like, how would you possibly turn this into a film? And I'm not sure what the answer to that would be. Like, as
Andy
soon as you
Serkis would be
create
involved.
like a digital worm with a human face that people have to talk to, like, how would you do that without it looking ridiculous? So if this Dune movies are like wildly successful, we'll see who has the unlucky job of trying to crack that walnut. So Matt, any closing thoughts on Dune the novel or Dune the motion picture, 85 2021, or Dune the television miniseries?
Well, the best thing about the David Lynch movie is definitely the fact that Patrick Stewart carries a small pug dog around,
Yes, Patrick Stewart plays Gurney Halleck, and he has a pug that he carries into battle with him.
right? We lose that in the new adaptation, which is a bummer.
Yes.
I think I do think Dune is one of my favorite books. I think I mean, there's plenty of science fiction books out there, and I wouldn't have read them all enough to give you a definitive statement on it. But I think it is a worthy book for people to read, even with trying to dissect some of those issues. I think this movie does a pretty good job of balancing all of those different elements. The Sci-Fi Channel miniseries has kind of a soft spot in my heart because I remember when it came out, and I remember watching it. Actually, they made a sequel, Children of Dune, which I remember being, and I did rewatch it some years later. And it is a TV miniseries. There are some moments where like, it's kind of cheesy, but like overall, it was like I think the Children of Dune series is like fairly well done.
And
It has Susan Sarandon and James McAvoy in it. So that's our episode on Dune. Come find us on social media. My handle on Twitter is at Army of Crime. Dustin's is at Dustin44444. We are on the web, armyofcrime.com. We are on your favorite podcatcher of choice, which you know because you're listening to it right now. Feel free to throw some stars on there, 5 stars. Why not? If you want to come find us and tell us we did a good job, sure. If you have constructive feedback, you know what? Life's too short to not hear constructive feedback. Everybody wants to get better, right, Dustin?
no, some people just want to get worse.
That's true. That's true. As always, stay alive out there, everyone.
Is that a cat?
That was a cat.